Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I will be talking about Season 2, Episode 26, I Killed the Count, Part 2, once again starring John Williams as Inspector Davidson. And this episode was pretty solid overall, just like Part 1. We get a lot more insight and information into both of our characters who have confessed to the killing of the Count. But the episode also leaves some things open, so the viewer will be invested in watching part 3. So overall, another solid episode, if not quite amazing. So after a funny recap by Alfred Hitchcock, where he kind of runs through everything that happened in the last episode, we pick up where we left off with Sorrington, who had confessed to the crime at the end of the last episode. It turns out that he had a daughter who was married to the Count, and there were a lot of problems with the marriage. It was not a good marriage. And he says this is the reason he killed the Count. He said his daughter escaped the Count, but the Count wanted her back. So basically, he confronted the Count on this. And we actually get to see a flashback scene here of Sorrington's version of the events. I really appreciated this. Instead of just telling us as a viewer, they actually gave us a scene to show us what happened. I thought this was a nice change of pace. So eventually, there's a struggle, and the gun goes off, and this seems like a plausible story that Sorrington was the one that killed the Count, but as we'll see, everything may still not totally add up. So at this point, we go back to Froy, who was the other man who confessed to the crime. The inspector confronts him, and Froy says he was basically in love with Sorrington's daughter that was married to the Count. And we also mentioned there was a daughter involved in this. We learn a little bit more about the bad marriage. So Sorrington's and Froy's stories do seem to match up in this regard. We get another flashback scene where Froy kills the Count after there's a struggle and the gun goes off. These scenes parallel each other nicely, Sorrington's and Froy's, and it also seems possible that Froy did this. But there's still some evidence not adding up, so the inspector is still pretty puzzled by this case. We are then introduced to a few other new characters, a Louise Rogers, who's questioned by the inspector, but it doesn't really go anywhere. I thought the scene was strange because it was so brief, but my guess is that this character will show up in part 3 because I have a feeling there was a reason she was put here. Otherwise, why show this character? So that will be interesting. We are also introduced to a Miss Laloon, who was a dancer. She chats with the inspector about the night before, and why this conversation is important is the inspector basically finds out that no one was on the lift the night before at 2 o'clock, which is important to the case and to our new suspect who's coming up soon. So it turns out that neither man's fingerprints ultimately match, being those of the killer, but we find out the fingerprints do match someone named Pat Lummick, who also turns out to be another name for Mullet, who's a character that we were briefly introduced to in part 1 and that showed up here again today in part 2. And the episode ends, of course, with this man confessing to the crime. So now we have 3 people saying that they killed the Count. And in kind of an interesting scene, the inspector is really irritated at this point. And I have to say, John Williams did a great job in this final scene of the episode. So like I said, in some ways a continuation of part 1, and in some ways a setup for part 3. I did think this was another effective episode, but it's just solid, not outstanding in my opinion. But still, I Killed the Count part 2 works nicely with part 1, and it still makes the viewer want to see part 3. So overall, I am going to give this episode a 3 out of 5. And so far, I do recommend I Killed the Count, but we'll see where it goes in part 3. So a 3 out of 5 for I Killed the Count part 2. And as always, thank you very much for watching.